Hello there, and welcome to episode one of the Lamp of Autonomous Light podcast. I am Frater Indra Maati, and I'm here today to happily announce the launch of this podcast. This podcast sets out to share my 20 years of experience of study and practice of the esoteric mystery tradition to help guide folks who are new to magic and spirituality and are seeking, a spiritual life, like a life of connection to spirit, to the elements, to themselves, to God, and Goddess, and all things, and how to merge study of wisdom tradition with practical daily life to live a fulfilling life and to really truly discover our own will and learn how to exact that will in the world. So, um, I feel like I don't really need to share too much about, my past other than that, like, I've been a student of the esoteric mysteries for 20 years. I started my studies at 18 years old after a bit of like a near death experience type thing, had like a health issue that, was like appendicitis and some mystery illness. And that led me to have to like inspect my human nature and even start to inspect the synchronicities that led me to begin to feel like life had a deeper meaning and purpose and story that was unfolding, which very early on I didn't really have the language or the context for what it is to go through this connection to mortality at an early age. And I know in other cultures that those kinds of experiences are often the kind of things that set people off onto the path of being a shaman, things like that. And I in my life have experimented with degrees of shamanism. I have apprenticed under medicine workers to a degree, and spent years in medicine circles, and spent a good part of my life, connected with plant medicine, and still work with plant medicine and stuff like that. Although, substances are less and less a part of my path, um, and more of a part of a sacred lane within the path. So I guess, this podcast is just the beginning of a space where I want to share a lane for people to their own spiritual experience. And, when I was a young person, I studied the occult and the esoteric for many years independently, and eventually made contact with an AA lineage, which is the Astron Argon, which is one of Aleister Crowley's private, you know, free teaching, not even really teaching, but free spiritual fraternities, mystery schools that has many different lineages from teacher to student throughout the world. And I was a part of one and chose to step aside, for personal reasons and stuff. But that never stopped my walking along the path, and never stopped the path of discovery that I've always been walking, since even before I ever stepped onto the path within a mystery school or an order of any kind. And so, one of the interesting things is that when I was within the order of the AA, I took an oath, to serve, um, neophytes and those who are seeking light, and although I am no longer part of a direct lineage any longer, just on my own volition, I still feel that oath that I took is a very real oath, and I consider a lot of what I do in life as a part of that oath. You know what I mean? And so this podcast is an expression of that, I guess. Of that, I've always sought to share my wisdom and experience and path to light to for other people. So uh, that all being said, I'm still a student of many different paths, and my path has always been informed by many paths. The even the AA itself recognizes that there is really, you know, only one school, and that's like the school of life and the school of light. And there have been many servants, of the flame, uh, of illumination, of self knowledge, of self development, um, and yeah, like self fulfillment, throughout time. And so the mystery schools serve this purpose, and have often kind of been trapped in systems of power. We understand that, like, a lot of times, the history of orders comes from wealth and institution and stuff like that. And Aleister Crowley's AA set out to kind of remove those restrictions of wealth and social status, and remove the dangers of ego from spiritual pursuit. And so the AA, you know, being an interesting example of the expression of humanity's understanding that the mysteries belong to everybody. You know what I mean? And so, I guess this podcast, The Lamp of Autonomous Light, this lane for like self knowledge and self initiation that I'm trying to open up for people, just as I opened up for myself in life. Um, it comes from that very same impulse, the just primal understanding, the natural understanding that um, light belongs to everybody. Light doesn't need to be trapped in institutions and circles of wealth and power and things like that. So beautiful thing about this Aquarian age we're shifting into, and the technologies available, is that we can use them to communicate with each other, and to really step into this age of light, this new age of the brotherhood of humanity. And so this podcast is an offering along that path for humanity. And with all that being said, I guess I'll give a little bit of a course run through, I guess, of like what this podcast will be covering, and what the gist of the layout of this show will be. It's really also going to be a layout of the different chapters of a book that I'm working on right now. And that book is called On Becoming a Starflower. And this kind of relates to the neophyte grade in what's known as like the Golden Dawn and the AA and the general magical path. So I've laid out some stuff that, from my self initiation journey, was really powerful for me in life, and stuff that along the way I've picked up um, myself and kind of added into my own initiatory journey. So I'd like to begin with this layout that I've created, that is a layout for the book, but it's also a layout for the podcast. And just anybody that would like to follow along this path of the Starflower that I'm opening up and laying out here. So this book and this podcast is going to begin with grounding and orientation. This is just going to be about, setting out on a spiritual path in life, like to start intentionally living a more spiritual life, to take on a path of self initiation into mystery, um, to set out to like to know the deeper mysteries of our nature. um it all must begin with grounding, and we have to really take a look at our lives and begin to like structure them, because if we're stepping onto the path of spiritual discovery, uh of magic, anything like that, like of discovering our spiritual nature and things like that, we first have to start with just the absolute basics in life, which is the physical body, the root chakra, Malkuth on the tree of life. We'll be getting into that stuff along the way. But we've got to just start with our earthly lives. You know what I mean? And if we want to have a more spiritual life, or a more spiritual experience of life, um, it starts in the body, and it starts in the root chakra. It starts in Malkuth, and it it begins with the examination, of our physical life, our physical needs. And, so any spiritual pursuit, um, begins with awareness, it begins with intent, orientation, and so when we set out on the spiritual path, we set out on an oriented life and a grounded life, and that begins in our bodies, so um, this path of the starflower that I'm laying out, it's got everything to do with our earthly lives and to do with the earthly nature of life, because as spiritual beings who come into this world, we come into the world through institutions, and we take on all these different operating systems of what the self is, who and what we are, and then we get released from the institutions, and we start experiencing self-determination, and this is when we begin to have that spiritual impulse in life, and more of a discovery of the self, like this for a lot of people obviously begins early in life. And if we're lucky, we maintain a connection to our spiritual self, and the deeper mystery of life throughout life. But let's just, for instance, just understand that the average person is goes through life kind of unaware that they are a magical being with magical power, with spiritual connections to the higher principles in reality, and all these things, so we've got to begin with grounding, in that, like, if we're going to begin applying awareness to life, um we have to be grounded, and we have to understand that to bring more awareness to life, it kind of disturbs the unconscious mechanisms of life, and so when we set out on a path of more awareness, it's going to be an uncomfortable one in the beginning, you know what I mean, because it is a uh it's a disturbance to the material, mechanistic, unconscious realities that have been created for us, in some ways out of love, the culture, the normalization, the reduction of the world to a palatable medium, that that's something that it's just a part of the expression of the love of humanity. And the world and the culture as it is always remains a reflection of how much we bring to it, as a collective, and so, like, I guess the hope is always that more awareness, produces more awareness of awareness, and wise, study creates wise choices, creates wise action, um, and then goodness is, you know what I mean? And so, I guess there's a big part of this whole podcast that is about absorbing, some of the wisdom tradition and grounding it in our daily physical lives. You know what I mean? But I think it must be said, at the beginning of any outset of increased awareness and of increased introspection and increased self-awareness, that it's bound to be uncomfortable. It's just how it goes. Anybody who has gone into therapy or has done any kind of spiritual reflection in life just knows that, like, spiritual growth is much more um kind of defined by stages of friction, um and polishing through friction almost, so uh I guess, that's another thing I would like to say here too, is that, like, any person who is really stepping onto a magical path or a deeper spiritual path, it's really good to be rooted in some form of psychological grounding too, such as, like, Jungian psychology, whether it's the study thereof, or even if you are in the position, and have, like, the privilege in life of access to mental health and things like Jungian psychotherapy. Those are the things that I recommend the highest for anybody who's called to um, really deep magical interest in life. I'm not saying it's like a must, but I think it's a really great idea, and it's recommended by a lot of the other voices in the occult tradition. That like if you're really going to take a deep dive and join an order, or just even just take on a path, or any of these kind of things. Having your mental health or a system or track for mental health in order is it's a good thing to have. And so also having things like spiritual community, study groups, church, just community in general, whatever that be in your life. That's part of also being grounded. The spiritual life is, at times, of course, one of the path of the hermit, the path of, um, your own, daily, nightly, internal, nurturing of that light, that lamp in yourself, um, but we must always be also grounded in our worldly lives and live in good accordance in community and in just the balance of life. So to begin this podcast and to begin this discussion about magic, and to go through, as I through the episodes, and I'll be listing, some of what the episodes coming up are. We'll be certainly starting with a lot of grounding. You know what I mean? And for people that want to really take on, like more intentional study and grounding, I will be having like lanes for people who want to contact me privately for consultation and thing like that. But, this podcast will be a free, path, of support. And my email and lanes will be open to people that, are experimenting with, any of the, um, context of the stuff that I'm sharing here for my own community, and just for everybody. And so like, um, I'm going to be sharing the stuff that I've found, really helpful to me, that I think is in good balance, and is worthwhile to extract from the wisdom tradition and apply to our daily lives. So, moving along with the consideration of grounding and orientation, um, you know, to have connection to our spiritual nature, um, our authentic self, our true center, that is something that can be attained through clarity, and like clarity is ever present, and there's something said in the Kabbalistic tradition, that Kether is in Malkuth and Malkuth is in Kether. And so that's to say something I always like to point out, which is that, you know, enlightenment, illumination, the highest degrees of consciousness, um, these things are not elsewhere. They're ever present. And a lot of the trap of spirituality and degrees of attainment and illumination and enlightenment and all that stuff is that there can be degrees of spiritual pride that come with uh the concretization of these spiritual processes and things. And so it's important, I think, to always remember that the goal is the present moment. It's not elsewhere. It's We are not seeking to escape the present moment or get to heaven or get to some otherworldly reality even. What what we're really seeking to do with living the spiritual life is to be able to harvest the gold, from the lead of reality. And so through the path of self knowledge and the path of, you know, involution and the path of individuation, as Carl Jung calls it, um, we turn inward and we understand that Kether is in Malkuth and Malkuth is in Kether. And it's in this understanding that we learn, um, both the patience and the immediacy of life, and there's something really interesting about duality that we'll be exploring throughout the earlier work in this podcast. As we live these earthly lives, with night and day and these natural tendencies of what we call male and female, God and goddess. Uh, it's through the the dynamo of this duality, expression of the unity of life, that the uniqueness of each one of us, the star flower that we are, comes to know its shape. You know what I mean? And we are indeed, like shaped through friction, the friction of daily life, the friction of our karma and our dharma, and um, to, like I said, begin on the spiritual path, we've got to start out with grounding, orientation, and with an understanding of duality, because like as we start to walk the path of light and we invite more light into our lives, we will also then increase like the shadow then also increases in a sense, because to bring in, you know, more light, it also like opens up more dark to explore, and so it's not to say darkness as in bad stuff, you know what I mean, but as in unconsciousness, as in like that which is yet to be revealed, um and this is something that we'll get into that's interesting about, the solar and lunar nature of magic, and of how the magus or the magician, wields a baton. You know what I mean? It's the wand is also a bit of a baton. It's a wand of dual power, and as we see with, even the caduceus, there's the dual serpents, that coil around the staff, which is also the human spine, and we'll be tapping into some of that with our hermetic study in this episode as well, and or later episodes, that is. But I figured I will give a brief little run through of what is up ahead for this podcast and what the contents of this upcoming book will be. But it may adapt as we go. I think this is, just some stuff that I've been laying out as I just intuitively, share my bits of inspired thought, So to start, we've already mentioned grounding and orientation a bit, and that brings us along to our next objective, which is the daily magical record, which is one of my favorite things that I highly recommend to all people that they begin the practice of. Um, I think a lot of us remember probably having diaries or journals as a kid, and in schools they probably taught us to have a journal. And as you get older, you realize these things are pretty precious and cool. And I've been lucky to find some of mine going like way back, and it's fascinating to see my own fascination with the things like ghosts and aliens and things like that, even from my youth, that carry on. And so, as we step onto the spiritual path, the path of more light, the path of more awareness, and the path of nourishing this star flower that we are, um, we start with the grounding, and then also like the daily magical record. It's a great thing to practice having a magical diary. We should always record the, results of our experiments, whether it's like scientifically or magically speaking, or whatever that is, I think it's um, important to record the results of experiments. And so, as we go forward, with this podcast, I'll be exploring more deeply the nature of the magical record, examples of what other historic magicians have done with the keeping of a magical record, and also, yeah, like beginning to share the practices that are like great kind of daily yogic exercises to start practicing. Yeah, just like daily magical spiritual uh, practice and communion and connection, And so I guess that's going to be the wrap of this first episode. This is really just an introductory thing that I'm kind of launching just real intuitively. And so, as I've shared with the layout, this index of the book that I'm writing, and the episodes I'll be sharing, yeah, we'll just be moving along, and I'll have an entire episode pretty much dedicated to the magical record coming up next in short time, and then yeah, I'm excited to move on into exploring foundational stuff, and yeah, just different episodes on different interesting things, and so. Thanks to anyone who's listening, and I'll look forward to connecting with folks. You can follow up with me via Indra's Logosphere at gmails.com. If you want to connect in any way, feel free. But yeah, stay tuned, and thanks for listening to this first episode of The Lamp of Autonomous Light, and peace.